Hello everyone, John here. Odds are if you're watching this, or listening to it, as the case may be, you're one of a very small group of people that look forward to this list at the end of every year. And this year I wanted to try and do something a little different and present to you my top 10 games of the year in audio/video format instead of doing a write-up. That way it's a little more interactive. For some, the more conversational approach is a little more amenable than having to read a big wall of text. So I hope this works out. I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you like it. And if you're not one of those small group of people for whom this is kind of a bit of a year-end tradition, then welcome. Thanks for listening, and I hope the holidays have found you safe and well. Before we get into the top 10, there are two things I want to talk about. One of those things is just that 2021 was a year that saw the continuation of the change that had happened to the entire world in 2020. And for a lot of people, video games were a way to cope. They were an escape. They were a familiar hobby, a familiar friend, in a time when a lot of people's lives were confronted with uncertainty or instability or, for some, straight up tragedy, unfortunately. And the last 2 years, for me, the thing that really came into focus for video games was I didn't realize the extent to which I really play games for a sense of community. Even if it's not with other people. You know, in this day and age, games don't just come out and exist amongst you and the friends that you see every day in real life. You know, that live down the street, or little Tommy has the Super Nintendo and we go over to his house and play it after school. It's not like that anymore. Every single game that comes out has a community built up around it because of the tools that exist in the world now that connect us all. Whether it's Discord or YouTube or Twitch or YouTube, live streaming or what have you, Messenger or WhatsApp gaming groups that we formed with our friends. All of those things make it easier for us to have experiences with people we've never met around games that we have in common. And so 2021 continued to be a year for me where that community piece really came into focus. Whether it was my playing the Lost Ark closed beta for the North American EU edition of Lost Ark coming out in February of 2022, or whether it was, continuing to play Smite, or whether it was going back to TFT and League of Legends for a little bit earlier in the year. The community's response to Civ 6 and its last little tiny bit of DLC before active development on it ceased. There were a lot of gaming experiences that I had that had a sense of community, and for that, I'm very grateful. And for that, 2021 was a great year. The other thing I wanted to talk about was I feel like I need to address two games that did not make it into the top 10, but are two games that I played so much of this year. And those two games are Humankind from Amplitude Studios, published by Sega, and New World published by Amazon Games. And I want to talk about those because they came so very close to getting on the top 10, but I could not bring myself to do it, and I feel like I want to talk about them, and I want to talk about why they didn't make it onto the top 10 list, because I did spend so much time with them this year, in many cases more time than I spent with the games on my top 10 list. Not in every case, but in many cases. So Humankind is a game for me that I was extremely excited for. It is a 4X strategy game in the vein of a Civilization or an Alpha Centauri, or not in the setting, but just in the genre. It is a 4X strategy game. Explore, exterminate, expand, exploit. And a lot of people were excited for this game, and a lot of people that are fans of the genre were skeptical about this game, especially after playing Open Devs. Because the approach that Amplitude Studios were taking was so... It was in the same context as the approach that Firaxis takes with Civilization, but it was in a different direction. There are some key differences between it and games in the genre that really kind of change up how you have to play and think about it. I think it's a good game. It might even be a great game by the time it has received, whatever expansions or DLCs that it's going to get. But the reason it didn't make it on the list is because it suffers from a number of really... I don't want to say poorly implemented systems, but systems that I think as a result of Amplitude taking the approach that it does to gathering community feedback via their Games Together program, it makes it a lot harder for that group of developers to sift through and ultimately make decisions about what direction their systems and mechanics need to take in order to fit the original, intent of the design of those systems. Because you get a lot of feedback from the people that play your Open Devs when you're Amplitude. And a lot of that feedback is on many different sides of the fence. And I've been on the forums, I've seen how difficult it can be to get a sense of what the community is thinking about your game, because there are like 4 different groups of people, all who are coming at the same problem from 4 different angles. And so I think because of that, some of the systems when the game came out felt a little half-baked. One of them in particular, the pollution system, felt extremely poorly implemented. Not just from a mechanical standpoint, as in like missing tooltips, but just the sheer balance of it. Like, it came out and the reaction from the community was very much, did like no one play test this like at all in any way, shape, or form before it was put in the game? So there were lots of instances of that. There were also, unfortunately, a number of bugs that were game-breaking or save-breaking, particularly when it came to multiplayer. Some of those multiplayer bugs, like turn hanging, where you can't end the turn, or you do end the turn and it never rolls over to the next turn, are still in the game. It also had a rash of balance issues that were... I don't want to say all of them were head scratchers, but there were a number of them that were like, how was this not... this is feedback that you got in the last 2 Open Devs. Why wasn't this addressed before the release of the game? Unfortunately, there are lots of great things about it. I think the fame system in that game is great. I think the idea of cultures and choosing a different civilization and culture every time you go into another era is fantastic. I think that the way they handle combat, it is my favorite tactical layer of combat in a 4X in recent memory. It is beautifully art directed. It is wonderfully animated. The music is fantastic. There are so many great things about it that make it a really wonderful experience to play, but unfortunately, those other things really get in the way of you being able to focus on the good parts of the experience, especially if you're paying attention to those kind of things and you're an experienced sort of 4X player. So that's why ultimately I couldn't put Humankind on this list, even though I really, really wanted to, because I spent a lot of time with it. The other game that didn't end up making the top 10, even though I went down quite the rabbit hole with this game, was New World. How I came to New World was very spur of the moment. It was like the second day of that game being out. It was splashed all over the main landing page of Steam. And I was like, you know what? $40, why not? I'll buy it. I'll try it out for a couple hours. If I don't like it, then I'll just refund it. And I tried it out, and 100 hours later, that speaks for itself. I went down a very, very, very deep hole with New World, where it was like all I played, and every waking moment that I was not working or eating or taking a shower was dedicated to New World. I started a company. I was part of my faction leadership for our server. I was organizing supply routes for trade goods and all those sorts of things, because my company was the crafting company for our faction. And there's a lot about New World that I think was cathartic for me in the year of 2021, when I personally went through a lot of things, one of them life-threatening, a health outcome that ended up being good because of a surgical correction later in the year. 2021 was a very difficult year for me personally, and I think New World was that catharsis that I needed to forget that all of that super challenging, difficult physical, mental, and emotional stuff was going on for me. And so I really value my experience and my time with it because of that. But at the same time, anyone who's paid attention to New World knows how utterly broken that game has been every time it's been patched, pretty much since it's gone out. How many times they've had to shut the economy off, which in an MMO is a big deal. When you are introducing feature bugs that literally break the economy of your MMO, there are big problems. And there are lots of videos on YouTube that you can go watch about the development of Amazon games, a lot of people making assumptions and suppositions, a lot of people who also are speaking with some authority as former members of that team, or having interviewed former members of that team who worked on the coding and the programming for that game. But there are whatever the reasons are, it made it so that eventually the player base just bled dry, and I don't play New World anymore. Like, I stopped playing, I want to say a couple weeks after my surgery, at the beginning of November. I kind of just dropped it because, people were leaving the faction and the companies on our server. People were transferring servers, people were dropping like flies from that game. And it was no longer the, 900,000 million active daily concurrent players that it was in the first couple weeks of its launch. Now it's sitting around, 70,000 to 120,000 pretty consistently, which is still pretty good. It puts it in the top 10 games pretty comfortably of games that are played on Amazon as far as concurrent player numbers go, but not necessarily when it comes to MMOs. I think that game, I will probably eventually go back to that game once enough time has passed. I think that there's just a lot of fundamental things broken in the foundational sort of coding and programming of that game that has caused them a lot of issues. And especially when you were like me and you ran a crafting company, and the value of your time is measured based on the output of the goods that you can put on the marketplace for the server and the economy on the server, to have things like that happen where, gold can be duplicated, or, people buy your items and you don't get the gold and they don't get the items. And for stuff like that to happen, it especially if you're like me and you play a lot of live service games, the sort of like time investment versus value proposition it breaks down at that point, and it becomes something that's not really worth putting your time into. So that is a reason. Those are the reasons New World ultimately didn't end up on this list. I'm not going to speak too much about the experience of actually playing it. Playing the game is very fun. Again, it was cathartic. For me, I don't think it's going to be a game that's for everyone. I think some people will hate the combat in it. Some people will hate the crafting system in it. Some people will hate the fact that it is really... most of the things you do in that game are funneled toward the PvP experience, which is a problem they're going to have to solve, because now with how many players that have left the game, they're really struggling to figure out how to implement meaningful PvE, which is what the majority of people left playing that game seem to want. Most of the players that are left are the people who were like me, who were out just gathering tons and tons and tons and tons, and hunting tons and tons and tons and tons, and mining and stone cutting and jewel crafting tons and tons and tons and tons. So the people that are left playing that game are PvE players. It seems. I could be wrong about that. But it will be interesting to see how that ship is righted. Hopefully it is. I think it will be. They've put out some good content in the last month and a half or so. All in all, I think that I will eventually go back to New World, but for this year, it sits just outside my top 10 as the 11th game. Humankind is the 12th game. That didn't quite make it. Okay, I feel a lot better about taking those two out behind the shed and putting them down. So now we'll go ahead and get into the top 10, I guess, without further ado. These are in a particular order. I have ordered them a certain way. And that matters for the purposes of, when we get down to it, ultimately what I think the best game of the year is. So we'll start with number 10, which is a game called Loop Hero. And Loop Hero is a game that is a kind of old school, graphically very old school, musically very old school, design-wise in some ways very old school, half auto-battler, half classic RPG, half loop-based game. In this game, you play a little dude or a little woman who goes around in a loop on a map. It has a card game aspect to it, in that you have cards in your hands that are like physical objects, like buildings or geographic features like mountains or meadows. It's a fantasy setting, but as you're traveling around this loop, enemies will appear on the loop, and then you battle them, and they drop loot, and you put that loot on your character. That then changes your stats, and every time you go around the loop, the enemies get harder and the quality of loot they drop goes up. So this idea of repetitiveness is really what fuels the playing experience of Loop Hero. And I think that's why it connected with a lot of people in the year 2021, because we found ourselves yet again in the throes of a pandemic, and a lot of people that I know personally, a lot of friends, a lot of family members have described 2021, a lot of people I work with have described 2021 like being stuck in a loop. Like it just felt like 2020 was repeating it again. And Loop Hero is a game that, whether they intended it to or not, because I think development on that game started just before the pandemic, actually, at a game jam in like October or November of 2019. I think the way it approaches repetitiveness in game design mirrored the way parts of our lives felt repetitive in 2021. And it was a game that I spent a good amount of time with. It is a game that has a lot of layers. There are a lot of interactions with the cards that you have in your hand that you uncover as you go along. But I think it's also a game that you either burn really hot on and you stay hot, or you burn really hot on and you burn out on. I don't think it's for everyone. I think it is a difficult game, and I think having to put in the effort to go through the repetitive nature of the game design and repeating this loop over and over and over and over and over again within a run can turn people off a bit, because it feels like progress comes very slowly in this game if you're not good at it. It is procedurally generated, so let's say if you die on one of those loops, then you go back to camp, and there's a meta progression layer in camp, and then you go back out onto a procedurally generated map where you have a new loop and you get a new set of cards, and you do it all over again. And there are, characters to unlock and new cards to unlock and the meta progression elements to unlock, all of those things. So it has roguelite aspects to it. And it's really the combination of those three things: the classic character sheet, kind of driven RPG, the card game element, and then this sort of roguelike kind of element that are driving the play experience within the context of the design idea of everything being repeated constantly. The story of the game is brilliant, and I think it's woven into the design of the game in a way that is really, really clever, and it deserves a lot of kudos for that. There are elements of time travel in the story that I won't spoil for you, but it plays into this notion of things repeating in some pretty surprising and, for me, kind of, like, somewhat profound and touching ways. It's an experience that's pretty cheap. It's not going to cost you a lot of money. I think I picked it up when it came out for like $15 or something like that. Maybe it was $20 on Steam. It recently just came to the Nintendo Switch, so it's on those two platforms now, and it is my 10th best game of the year. My number 9 game is a game that came out at the very beginning of the year that I think a lot of people are going to forget about on their Game of the Year lists, because it came out in January or the beginning of February, and that game is called Skull the Hero Slayer. And Skull the Hero Slayer is a game, I believe it's developed by a Korean development studio. I could be extremely wrong about that, so I can't wait for someone to correct me down in the comments. Hopefully you do it nicely, please. This is a roguelike game that is in the vein of a Hollow Knight or a Dead Cells or a Hyper Light Drifter, those sorts of things. It is a side-scroller, vibrantly colored, sprite-based 2D game that has a meta progression level and that has a Metroidvania touch in that your map progression is procedurally generated and you're going between rooms, if you will, as you sort of move throughout your progression with the game. Look, there is no secret sauce here. This is just a really good one of these games. It is funny, it is charming, it is wonderfully crafted, in the artistic sense. The animations are fantastic. The classes in the game are presented via the different skulls that your little skeleton boy can wear. So in order to change classes, you literally just wear a different skull and then you become that class. And there are some really inventive classes in this game, like, the Rocker class, or the Ghost Rider class, the Necromancers, the Samurais, the Jesters, they have all the archetypes, the Freeze guy, the Water guy, the Earth guy, the Fire guy, and they have archetypes that you never would have thought of before either. It is a really just wonderfully crafted and extremely fun game that I had such a blast with, and that I will absolutely continue playing into the future. For a lot of people, this game enters into and sits in the roguelite canon with the likes of a Rogue Legacy, a Dead Cells, a Hyper Light Drifter, a Curse of the Old Gods, a Hollow Knight. It joins that group of sort of esteemed, sort of canonical roguelike games, because it's so well crafted and because it's such a great experience of one of those. And it has everything you expect to find in one of those, whether it's, build progression and itemization over the course of a run. Enemy variety isn't quite there as much as I would like it to be. It has epic boss fights, great music. Again, the art style is fantastic. The controls are tight. It's just really good. And if you're a fan of those types of games, there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't pick it up. I played it first on PC, where it was in early access for a little bit. I believe it has since come to PS4 and Microsoft Xbox consoles, as well as the Nintendo Switch. I have it on PC and Switch. So pick it up. If you're a fan of one of those games, there's really no reason for you not to. Okay, the next two are heavy hitters. Number 8 is Monster Hunter Rise. And personally, I think Monster Hunter Rise got shafted by the community. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think that is, and why Monster Hunter Rise is actually one of the better Monster Hunter games to be made. I can already hear a lot of my friends who are going to listen to this rolling their eyes and telling me that I'm wrong, but hear me out, okay? So, Monster Hunter World came out, and it was followed by Monster Hunter Iceborne. And for that franchise, Monster Hunter World represented a breakout into an international audience that Monster Hunter had never, ever, ever had before. Monster Hunter World was a game that was deliberately designed to have appeal to gamers outside of Japan. And boy, did they ever nail it, because the majority, not only did it become Capcom's best-selling game of all time, beating out games in the Street Fighter series, but it became Capcom's best, monetarily best-selling game of all time. Again, beating out Street Fighter that has tons of microtransactions for costumes and music and stage and this and that and all the other. So, it 1000% accomplished its goal of gaining mass appeal outside of Asia. And the vast majority of people who played that game, it was their first time really engaging with a Monster Hunter game. To this day, you still see people on the Monster Hunter World subreddit saying, hey, I just picked this game up on a sale. It's my first time playing. I can't believe how fantastic Monster Hunter is. To that degree, it was many people's first experience of Monster Hunter, but it was also a very different Monster Hunter game in terms of how they approached providing content for the game. Monster Hunter games traditionally have come out, they've been single disc releases that came out, you bought it in a store, and then you didn't hear anything from the developers for another 1.5 to 2 years, and then the G-Rank version would come out of that game. And the G-Rank version would add a new locale, a whole bunch of new monsters, new armor, new weapons, all that kind of stuff. And then that was just the final version of the game. That was how Monster Hunter lived. It was sort of a packaged, complete, solitary experience that came out, that you played, that you grinded, that you crafted stuff for, that you perfected a build for. It was about the chase of the perfect build. And then Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Iceborne came out, and for the first 6 to 7, maybe 8, 9 months of Monster Hunter World, there really wasn't that much content released at all. There were some updates, with some stickers and some new hair and animations and whatnot, but they didn't really start adding new monsters and new monster fights and new armor and new weapons through free updates until, 9 to 10 months into Monster Hunter World. And that continued throughout the life cycle of Monster Hunter World. And it continued in the form of festivals as well. The Autumn Festival and the Cherry Blossom, Chinese New Year Festival. There was a Christmas one usually. There was a Halloween one. There were lots of them over the years. A summer one, that had their own corresponding layered armor sets for you and your Palico and weapons and all that kind of stuff. And then Monster Hunter Iceborne came out, which was the expansion to Monster Hunter World, and that game's life after it came out followed exactly the same trajectory of just having content constantly added to it. So fast forward to the announcement of Monster Hunter Rise. I think a lot of people were surprised that it was a Nintendo exclusive, even though they shouldn't have been surprised that it was a Nintendo exclusive, because anyone that knows Monster Hunter knows that Nintendo has always gotten exclusive Monster Hunter games. Monster Hunter Generations, Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. There was a version of 3 that only came out on the Wii U. That has always been the case. There have been sort of the quote-unquote mainline Monster Hunter games that have always come out, on PlayStation and whatnot, and then Nintendo has always been over there doing its own thing with Monster Hunter games. So that came as a surprise to the people for whom Monster Hunter World was their first Monster Hunter, and a lot of people were bummed about that. You go into Monster Hunter Rise with a lot of people playing it were people for whom their first Monster Hunter game was World and was Iceborne, and their expectation of what Rise's content injection would be like is that it would be like those games, that it would just constantly be receiving all this new stuff all the time. And we came to find out, even though Monster Hunter Rise received way more content in the first 6 months of it being out, as far as new monsters and new layered armor and new this and new that, than Monster Hunter World ever did, people still complained because they burned through the content that was in Monster Hunter Rise way fast, and then the updates couldn't come fast enough to keep up with, their expectations of what they thought should be in the game. When very clearly, this was not supposed to be like Monster Hunter on the Nintendo is not a live service game. They've never approached Monster Hunter games on Nintendo like that. Then again, they've never approached Monster Hunter games like that before Monster Hunter World and Iceborne either. But it became clear pretty fast that their approach to how they were going to do content for Monster Hunter Rise was very different than how they did content for Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Iceborne. And I think that honestly pissed a lot of the fan base off. To which I say, you're all just a bunch of spoiled brats like Angelica from Rugrats, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. In no way does Monster Hunter Rise's inability to meet your content expectations reflect on the quality of the game that it is. Monster Hunter Rise is one of the best Monster Hunter games ever made, period. And I will tell you why. Say whatever you want to say about the addition of the dogs and the palicos and all of that stuff. Monster Hunter Rise is one of the best Monster Hunter games. It could be solely based on the inclusion of one thing. And that is the wire bugs. The wire bugs and the addition of all of the mechanics that come along with the wire bugs in Monster Hunter Rise so drastically change the experience of playing one of these games that it is almost like it is almost like it's not even a Monster Hunter game. That's how different it feels. If it weren't for the fact that you were using the weapons and wearing the armor, and the animations didn't have that classic Capcom Monster Hunter development studio kind of feel to them, you wouldn't necessarily know that this is a Monster Hunter game. It would almost feel, in some spots, more like a game made by Platinum Games. The wire bug gives the levels a verticality, and combat a verticality to it, that I honestly can't imagine ever going back and playing Monster Hunter the way that I used to anymore. Like, it's so enjoyable to me to be able to use the wire bug to engage in parts of the map and in combat with a verticality that I've never been able to experience before. Unless you were an Insect Glaive player. Just putting that out there. And there are a lot of other things about it that I like too. I like the way they handle endemic life, that they're out there on the map and you have to go find them and you have to collect them. I like that there's an element of really asking you to use this new movement tool that the game has given you to engage in movement that is vertical. I do understand the criticism that the combat in Monster Hunter Rise is maybe a little too arcadey for some, because it is. Because the wire bug so drastically breaks how powerful the player character is in that game, that it almost doesn't matter how fast or how crazy or how powerful a monster is when you have the ability to just zip around everywhere and avoid being hit. So it does feel a little less weighted towards slow, deliberate, careful study of animation, like, Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter World Iceborne and past Monster Hunters have been, and a little more towards an action-oriented combat system, which I like. I appreciate that approach to Monster Hunter, and I think it works in the context of Monster Hunter Rise in a way that so sets Rise apart from other Monster Hunter games that it deserves, and that development team deserves respect and deserves applause for thinking about the Monster Hunter formula and how they can make it different, what else they can do with it. Because at the end of the day, yeah, they could sit there and pump out Monster Hunter games every single year, just like they pump out Battlefield games, just like they pump out Call of Duty games, just like they pump out FIFA games, just like they pump out Civilization games, which also used to have this problem, that eventually people fall off because the design elements get stale, and people want to play something different. And then when development studios go and try something different, like Monster Hunter Rise, yes, critically, among critics it reviewed well. Among fans, I feel like Monster Hunter Rise was received very lukewarm. You know, there was excitement about it when it came out, and then a couple weeks after it came out, it was like the community went back to Monster Hunter World. And me putting it on this list is part of my way of trying to show the development team that I really do appreciate the different approach they take, because I think stretching and growing the design approach behind Monster Hunter is ultimately what is going to allow that series to remain fresh and new, because they're going to take things that worked in Rise that people liked, and they're going to incorporate it into future Monster Hunter games. They're absolutely going to do that. And they should. They absolutely should. So number 8, Monster Hunter Rise. If you're a Monster Hunter fan, you probably have already played it. If you're not a Monster Hunter fan, it's a really good one, a really good first one of those to pick up. Moving on to number 7. Number 7, we have Age of Empires 4. I was surprised that this game ended up as high on my list as it did. I originally had it at number 10, and then I thought about it. And the reason I put it at number 7 is because when I think about what Age of Empires 4 could have been, the absolute dumpster fire that it could have been, the fact that it came out the way that it did, and that it is as good as it is kind of a miracle. For those of you who don't know, Age of Empires 4 is the 4th game in a long-running real-time strategy series that started with the original Age of Empires, which was a game, an RTS game set during ancient times, Grecian, Roman times, those sorts of things. And after that came Age of Empires 2, which is one of the big sort of top, 3-5 sort of genre-defining real-time strategy games. And then came Age of Mythology, which was very different than Age of Empires 2, and the community was very split on that game. And then came Age of Empires 3, which was probably the game that destroyed, in most people's minds, the likelihood of there ever even being an Age of Empires 4. I personally really like Age of Empires 3. I think that, again, the fact that it does something new and different is very, very good. It does, however, suffer from an inability to rein it in sometimes, because it does suffer from a design approach that almost gives you too much choice as a player. And, there was like Age of Empires Online, which was an online game that ended okay, but did not start okay. And so, over the years, people had gone back to Age of Empires 2. When Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition was released several years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, maybe even longer than that, most Age of Empires players went back to that game. And let me tell you, most people don't know this, but that game was super, 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 super popular. As popular, probably, as StarCraft, as far as concurrent players sometimes. When there was a competitive esports tournament going on for Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition, it regularly drew in Twitch viewership between 80 and 120,000 viewers. We're regularly on the weekends, 25, 30,000 players playing ranked games, which for an RTS game is like unheard of. So when you think about what an Age of Empires 4 game is, you also are thinking about, like, what does making an Age of Empires game that will satisfy Age of Empires 2 players, satisfy Age of Empires 3 players, but not repeat the mistakes of Age of Empires 3, and bring in a new audience? Like, even beginning to try and answer those questions, I don't know what I would have done. And the fact that Relic Entertainment, which is known for making some of the best strategy games of all time, so of course if anyone could do it, they would do it. The fact that they did it, and that Age of Empires 4 is as good as it is, like I said, really is kind of a miracle. The core of the experience, the core of the strategy experience, is very much akin to Age of Empires 2. It borrows a lot of its systems and mechanics from the legacy of Age of Empires 2. However, it does incorporate some of the good parts about Age of Empires 3 that players did have good feedback about Age of Empires 3. For instance, like the Age Up mechanics in Age of Empires 4 are borrowed loosely from the Age Up mechanics found in some of the civilizations of Age of Empires 3. Not only that, but this idea of asymmetrical faction design is borrowed slightly from Age of Empires 3. Factions in Age of Empires 2 don't have, they have differences, but those differences are around typically like numbers. They're not around mechanics. They're not fundamentally changing how you engage the game systems. In Age of Empires 2, Mayan archers might have extra pierce armor and, 2 more range. Or longbowmen might have 1 more range and 3 extra pierce armor. And that's kind of the difference between those unique units for those two civilizations. But in Age of Empires 4, you have something like the British, for example, who play way, way different than their Age of Empires 2 or even Age of Empires 3 iteration, where not only are they aging up and picking a specific sort of landmark to age up with every time, but their longbowmen have like 3 or 4 active skills that they can use. So there's an element of microing in this game that's not present in other games, but the English also have this unique ability to fire faster when they're within the certain radius of their town buildings. Their farms will produce gold. Their farm rate is increased. There are ways and approaches and choices that you will make playing the English in Age of Empires 4, and prioritizations that change your build order. So that instead of going, 4 people on wood early and 5 people gathering food, you might have 2 people on wood, 2 people on gold, and 5 people gathering food still. So it really plays into that idea of asymmetrical faction design. There are some that are extremely different. The Abbasids play way different than any other faction. Delhi plays way different than any other faction. The Mongols play way different. The Rus play way different. There are just so many different avenues of macro layer decision making that are baked into the asymmetrical nature of the faction design that really set Age of Empires apart from Age of Empires 2 and 3. But because the mechanical, combat, and tactical and strategy layer is so lathered in the legacy of Age of Empires 2, it still feels like a familiar game. And so I think it satisfies and accomplishes the mission that it set out to do in appealing to the widest possible audience of Age of Empires fans while trying to get new people. I will also say it is, even though I typically do not like real-time strategy campaigns, the only one that I really have is StarCraft and Grey Goo, which was a fantastic little RTS that came out way back in the mid-teens. I will say that Age of Empires 4's approach to doing a kind of more documentarian style of campaign is really, really clever. And it is very clear that they did not skimp on production value for their campaigns that are quite literally shot like historical documentaries that you would have seen on the History Channel back in the day before it became the Aliens and Hitler Channel. A fantastic RTS game in a day and age when RTS games are struggling to find footing, in a day and age when 4X games are struggling to find footing. I say between Humankind and Age of Empires 4 and a few others coming out this year, there is definitely sort of greener pastures on the other side of the mountains for those two genres. Especially when you look at all of the innovative titles that are going to be coming out next year between Terra Incognita. There's another one I'm forgetting the name of that starts with an F. You had Homeworld 3 announced. I think the next several years are going to be really important for the genre, and I think when people look at the continuity of the genre in this period of time in the early 2020s, they're going to look at games like Humankind and Age of Empires 4 as the start of what became a really good 3 or 4 years for those two genres. Number 6 on our list is Chivalry 2. Ah, yes. So, Chivalry 2 is the game that I have had absolutely the most fun with this year. And it has had a lot of development issues and a lot of backlash from the community about some pretty poor decision and pretty poor communication they've had with the community about some core things they said would be in the game that didn't end up being in the game. Putting that aside, just from pure fun factor, this game and one of the other games on the list are the two games that I had, bar none, the most fun with the entire year. And I am still playing Chivalry 2. Even though the player count has dropped so drastically, even though sometimes there's games where half the people there are bots, and not even human beings, Chivalry 2 is so much fun that I just can't stop playing it. Like a medieval combat simulator that is arcadey, where I can pick up a chicken, touch it to a torch, light it on fire, throw it at a guy, catch him on fire, and then pick up a piece of poop and throw it at him and he dies, is absolutely one of the 10 best games of the year. There's just no universe in which the year does not pass without a game like that being on my top 10 list. It is fucking hilarious and fun, and it is just a factory of laughs. It really, really, really is. The game modes are fun if imbalanced. The maps are fun if imbalanced. The progression system is fantastic. The way you unlock, cosmetics and gear and whatnot for your various classes. The fact that there even are classes, quite frankly, I was surprised. I thought it was just going to be, because I've never played a Chivalry game before, I thought it was just going to be, oh yeah, you have your Nightman and you equip a different weapon and then da-da-da. No. The classes all have abilities. They have things they can do that the other ones can't. There are subclasses within each class that also have their own unique set of abilities and weapons that no other subclass can use. It is such a fun game. And if you are looking for mindless fun, it is 1000% a game that you should pick up. I would say pick it up on a sale. I really hope the player base comes back. They just had a free weekend and the player base jumped up a whole bunch. A whole bunch of people bought the game because they played it and saw how fun it was. I think it's on, it might not be on Game Pass actually now that I think about it, because it was an Epic Store exclusive for a while. I don't know if it still is. Either way, one of my favorite games of the year, number 6 on the list, and that will move us on to number 5, which is a game called Dice Legacy. Now, I was not sure that Dice Legacy would make this list, and I went back and I played a whole bunch of it again in November and the beginning of December to try and figure out whether or not it was going to make the list. And when I re-engaged with it, because I played it when it first came out, it took a lot of really applying myself. I will admit that. Like, it's not an easy game to get into, and it really asks a lot of your attention. And it's a little finicky, which in my strategy games tends to turn me off. But I ended up finding an experience that was very weirdly relaxing. Sort of like, I guess, maybe how people find doing crossword puzzles or word searches relaxing. Dice Legacy is a strategy game that is a dice game that is also a survival game, that is also a resource and labor management game. This game is about systems and managing your stockpiles and managing the number of workers you have dedicated towards specific tasks. And that's done through dice. So you roll dice, and these dice represent citizens. And the buildings that exist on the map have dice slots. And so when you roll the dice will display a side that indicates what type of work that dice can be dedicated towards. And then the dice say you want to cut some wood. Well, you have to roll a woodcutting die. You have to roll a die and a die face that is for woodcutting, and then if you do, you can put that woodcutting die in the woodcutting slot of a lumber mill, and it will take a certain amount of time to produce goods from that job. And then when it does produce those goods, it will come back into your dice pile. It will kind of go into a dice discard pile, if you will. What complicates this even more is the fact that dice have a life counter on them. You can only roll dice a certain amount of times. Now, of course, there are buildings that you can unlock where you can increase the amount of quote-unquote life that a dice has. But it means that you're juggling the resources you need to make better buildings with the life of your dice, and the fact that when you accumulate enough resources and enough buildings from one sort of progression silo, you advanced to the next, which change your dice. You can upgrade dice from, worker dice to citizen dice to leader dice to so on and so forth. And when they do that, they're locked into that group of dice, and those dice have a specific type of job that they can be allocated toward. So it turns into this really complex, interesting, intricate balance of game systems. Like this is a totally a game theory type of game, and I'm not very good at it. But I find it so engaging and fun to play that I couldn't not put it on this list. I think it's not quite like anything I've ever played before. I've played a lot of management games. I've played Anno games. I played Shadow Empire, which that's a story for another time. But this game, Dice Legacy, it just struck me as particularly special in the experiences that I had this year because of the way it presents its systems. So even amidst all this kind of, dice game stuff is another layer that is the survival aspect, which is that the seasons are changing. And when winter comes, the dice can freeze. Your workers can die. They can become unavailable. The amount of time it takes them to do a task increases or whatnot. And this is the type of game where the amount of time where it takes to do a task is extremely important, because that's what you plan everything around. So okay, I have 15 seconds. This dice is going to take 15 seconds to cut wood. When it's done, I can immediately put it over here to harvest some food, because winter is coming in 30 seconds, and it takes him 15 seconds to harvest food. And if I can get him out of there in 15 seconds from the wood and into the food for 15 seconds and use his last life, or his second to last life, so he only has one life left, and then boom, I can take him out of there, and for winter, he can go into the Capitol building, and he can gain 5 life back over the winter. He can just sit in there and gain 5 life back. Like, there's that level of planning you're doing all throughout the play experience. And the goal is, it's set on kind of like a Halo-esque ring, where the map is the interior of this ring, and you're building out further and further and further along in the ring, and going through seasons, and your dice are living and dying and having babies. They're like literal people. It is out on PC. It is also recently released on the Nintendo Switch. It is a fantastic game. It's not for everyone. If you don't like strategy games, don't play this. I think this is going to appeal to people who like strategy games, who really like game design, and who like managing systems. If you like managing systems, then Dice Legacy is going to be for you. So that's number 5. We're going to move on to number 4 now. And number 4, I have been waiting to put number 4 on a Game of the Year list for 2 years. Because I have had this game in early access for 2 years, and I have a policy of not putting early access games on my top 10 lists. I only consider them if they have been released that year. Number 4 is a game called Gunfire Reborn. Gunfire Reborn is an amazing game. It is developed by a studio, I believe, out of China. I want to say either Hong Kong or Shanghai. And you can see that reflected in their news posts on Steam, because they're clearly translated by someone who speaks Chinese into English. So what Gunfire Reborn is it is a map-based, procedurally generated roguelike, first-person shooter similar to like a Ziggurat. And this game actually bumped Ziggurat 2 off of my list, because Ziggurat 2 is another one of those types of games that came out this year, and I played an awful lot of that as well. It was probably my 4th most played game this year. Gunfire Reborn, actually, I think I have less time in. But Gunfire Reborn, the reason I think that it has had such a positive response from and appeal toward not only people who like first-person shooters in general, like Seagull, the Overwatch Pro, and actually a few other Overwatch Pros have played this game on their streams and have streamed it several times. The reason it has such appeal is because its mechanics are so tight. Like, it's shooting, and it has the kind of attention to the detail of its mechanical first-person shooting play that appeals to people for whom competitive first-person shooting is something they love. Valorant players tend to have tended to really gravitate toward Gunfire Reborn as well. But the entire design and the entire aesthetic of this game is presented through a layer of cultural design. It is so distinctly Chinese. And I say that, having studied Chinese. My degree is in Chinese studies. I lived in China for a year and a half. I've studied there. I've been there. I've lived there. I have observed and lived in the culture. I have succumbed to its assimilation to some extent when I lived there. It fundamentally changed the way I think and broadened my horizons in some way and scared me in others, and yada yada, so on and so forth. But I can confidently and honestly say that the art, the music, the choice of even words to use, the translation, it is such a fresh experience for Western audiences within this genre of first-person roguelites that there's just no way I couldn't put it on this list. Like, it's so good. It is a class-based first-person roguelite out of China that is expertly crafted, that appeals to people who just want to have casual fun, but also to competitive shooter players. It controls beautifully. It plays beautifully. The music is fantastic. The art is fantastic. It is, in a lot of ways, every single thing you could ask to be perfect about this type of game is perfect in Gunfire Reborn. And I think they did a fantastic job staying true to the part of the world that they come from and speaking their lived cultural and social experiences into the game design. And not, succumbing to the pressure they might have felt to westernize it to appeal to a wider audience. I think Western players have seen the authenticity and genuineness with which the game has been designed, and they have responded to it in kind. And they love it because it's so unlike anything else Western audiences have ever played in the genre, that it is at once arresting. It's like you're sitting there playing Ziggurat 2, and then you see a trailer for this or someone playing it, you're like, what is that? I want to play that. I want to play that game. It really has that effect. And I had a lot of fun with this game this year. I think it's really fantastic. If you're a fan of first-person shooter games, you owe it to yourself to check out Gunfire Reborn. It is fantastic. It is a run-based first-person shooter roguelike game. It has a meta progression. It has class-based characters. If you like that kind of stuff, you owe it to yourself to check it out. That's number 4. Moving on to number 3 is a game that I almost put at number 1, but ultimately ended up kind of getting knocked down the list in favor of 2 others. But number 3 is a game called Riftbreaker, and I'm willing to bet that most of you have not heard of this game and have no idea what it is. So a lot of you may have heard of Factorio, or the Dyson Sphere program. Well, Riftbreaker is kind of one of those. Perhaps you've heard of They Are Billions. It's more akin to a They Are Billions in a Factorio than it is a Dyson Sphere program. But it is a management base building strategy game that is combat and arcade forward. So I have not played Factorio. I can't speak to that game. I have played They Are Billions, and I find that game to be very much kind of like competitive StarCraft single-player experience. If that makes any sense to you whatsoever, hopefully it does. All of that to say, Riftbreaker is a run-based, there's also a campaign, but really the core of its experience is going to be procedurally generated maps on which you are setting up supply chains to farm resources, to progress your weapons, your armor, your technology, all the while battling back wave after wave after wave of aliens. And that is where the base building comes in, where you're setting up a base, you're putting up turrets, you're putting up defense points, you're putting up minefields, you're thinking about, okay, where are the resources? How do I get power out there? How do I protect it? Okay, this resource is over here. I need to then get this resource from over here. I need to send them back here so I can build this building that will allow me to upgrade this technology so that I can build this building, all in the name of eventually opening up the Rift Gate and getting out of there, yada yada, so on and so forth. There are random map events too, the biome of the map. There's acid and tropical and, fire, molten, freezing, and all those kinds of things. Each of them having their own effect on the gameplay. Like some don't have as much wind, and therefore wind generators aren't really a viable option. The molten planets don't generate sun, so you can't really get your power from solar panels, etc., etc. The molten ones also, you can't place buildings just on the ground. You have to place you have to essentially build over a floor on top of the lava before you're able to put a building down, which I found to be, it's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that, but I guess that's true. You probably couldn't just put a research lab in lava. That'd be a bad idea. But the reason this is number 3, and this is the other game that when I was talking about Chivalry 2, I said the 2 games I had the most fun with this year. This is the other one. The gameplay loop is so super satisfying, and everything in this game, ultimately, yeah, it's got the resource management, and it's got the base building, but it's not to a level of detracting from what the developers wanted the experience of playing Riftbreaker to be. And what they wanted the experience of playing Riftbreaker to be was fun. They wanted the game to be fun. And by fucking God, Riftbreaker is fucking fun. It is a great game. You're killing aliens. You're bashing them, you're blowing them up, you're setting them on fire, you're lasering them, you're disintegrating them, you're vaporizing them, all the while just watching numbers go up and up and up and up and up and up and unlocking new stuff and new toys and it is a video game-ass video game, and I think anyone who plays video games knows what I mean when I say that. And in a year that was as difficult as it was for as many people as it was, we need experiences like Chivalry 2 and Riftbreaker to make us smile, to make us laugh. Those 2 games provided that in spades for me this year. I think the reason it's number 3 on my list is because it's not easy to design one of these games in the shadow of They Are Billions and Factorio. It's not easy at all. And to do it to the degree that they have, with the success that they have, for it to be as fun as it is, yet as different an experience as it is from those two games, is fantastic. It's not as heavy into the actual supply chain management as Factorio. It's not as heavy into the timing-based, sort of micro-heavy part of There Will Be Blood. It is, again, much more geared toward an arcadey type experience where setting up and getting resources and laying out your base and putting up your defenses it's not easy, but it is easily accomplishable. Let's put it that way. Like, you can do it. It's not a struggle like it is in those other two games. This is the beginning of a streak of these types of games coming out. Dyson Sphere program is still in early access. There's Age of Darkness, which just came out from an Australian design team earlier this year in early access. There's Alien Marauder as well. Mech Assault, I believe, as well. Maybe it's not called Mech Assault. I forget the name of it. But there are a couple of these games that are going to be releasing over the course of the next, year and a half to 2 years. And so I think you're going to see a lot more people start to engage with this particular genre of games, which is great. It was great. I think the mass appeal that There Will Be Blood and Factorio had will continue. Riftbreaker is a really, really great one of these types of games. And, if you're into strategy games and you're into having fun, then it's totally a game you should pick up. It is on PC and I believe also Xbox. So you can pick it up one of those two places. That is number 3, Riftbreaker. So now we're down to top 2, and these two have switched positions so much over the course of the last, week or two, but I ultimately have settled on this order. So number 2 is none other than Soren Johnson's Old World. Now, for those of you who are 4X strategy gamers, you will know the name Soren Johnson because he was the lead designer on Sid Meier's Civilization 4, which for many people my age is widely regarded as the best Civilization game. Not the best Civilization game. It is widely regarded as like the first Civilization game that they came to. My first Civilization game was Civilization 4. I went back and played 1 through 3. I have played 5 and 6. I have been a lifelong Civ fan and will continue to be because of Soren Johnson's design of Civilization 4. And he left that company after the design of that game. He started Mohawk Games. They designed a game called Off-World Trading Company, which my best friend Alex and I have played. We're really into for a couple weeks there. Brilliant game, a real kind of masterclass in sort of stock trading, economic gameplay in a multiplayer setting. It's really good. It's a very unique play experience. And Old World is his first foray back into the classic 4X genre that he started with in Sid Meier's Civilization 4. And boy, what a return it is. Old World is the single most important 4X game to come out in the last 5 years. And that is saying a lot. I think Civ 5 made big splashes moving the series from Stacks of Doom in Civ 4 to 1 unit per tile in Civ 5. Civ 6 made huge changes and advancement to that franchise by implementing a kind of weather catastrophe system, and this idea of ages, and the way religion works is completely and totally different. Tourism became a much bigger system to manage in Civilization 6. Its single most important contribution was this notion of unpacking cities, so that everything you ever built wasn't built in one central location, but that your science buildings were built in a campus district that you had to place physically somewhere on the map. Its biggest contribution to the genre was that, and making the map feel more alive, making it feel more useful, making it feel like there were more tactical and strategic choices to be made while you're out there. Old World all of that I just said about Civ 6 is in the service of advancing 4X design within the context of the Sid Meier's Civilization franchise. Because at the end of the day, what you do in those games is still the same from game to game to game to game to game. You know you're going to have a leader. You know you're going to have a civilization that they correspond to. You know they're going to have abilities and unique units and unique buildings or unique improvements. And you know that you're going to win the game in one of 5 different ways: culture victory, or a science victory, or a diplomatic victory, or a score victory, or a domination victory. That's just the way Sid Meier's Civilization has always been. It is probably the way that series will always be. So the implications of the design innovations that Civ 5 and Civ 6 made take place largely within the context of that franchise and not necessarily the genre of 4X as a whole. And for Old World, it feels very much like the opposite, where the implications of the design innovations that are made in Old World are very much felt within the genre and not specific to Old World. Old World takes Soren Johnson's approach to 4X design in Civ 4. You know, your grid-based, it is 1 unit per tile, improvement-based systems, and layers on top of that a Crusader Kings-esque relationship and person sort of character management system, to which all of the generation of your various bonuses like culture and science and training and orders, this resource in the game called orders, discipline, religion, all of those sorts of things. Yes, there are buildings that can tweak, you know, the numbers that you get. There are units you can make that have abilities that can tweak the numbers that you get of those yields. But the core way to manage your trajectory in those yields is by managing your characters and the relationships that they have. And in that regard, it is a fully fleshed out system. Not only including random events and choice-based narrative events, but all of the mechanics in a way tie back in to this sort of character management system in a really satisfying way that makes it feel like the world is alive, not because, you know, you're declaring war, but the world is alive because you're playing, you know, Philip of Macedon, and your wife is sick, but she's the head of your religion, and your son hates you and is probably engaged in an assassination plot against you, Alexander, because he hates you so much, and you know that if your wife dies, there's no longer anything between you and your son. And so how do you deal with that? What do you do? Do you seek the protection of one of the 3 families that exist within your empire? This game also has a very complex, almost like Game of Thrones-esque family house system to deal with, that all of those houses generate their own set of characters that can be ambassadors or scholars or chancellors or in charge of your military or generals or governors within your empire. And you carry out sort of relationship management not only externally through diplomacy with other nations and city-states throughout the map, but internally. There's a layer of interpersonal sort of diplomatic interactions you're having with the various families in your empire, but also the characters within those families and the people within your own family. And it creates this really interesting sort of emergent, character-driven story and gameplay experience that quite simply does not exist in any other 4X strategy game that you can play. And if I'm Firaxis, and if I'm a young game designer out there with dreams of making a 4X game, or if I'm wanting to, you know, try and revive Masters of Orion or something like that, then I'm looking at this extremely impressive character and relationship management system that Soren Johnson has put in to Old World, and I'm going, wow, that is an innovation. That is moving the genre forward. That is a fundamentally new play experience that people in the 4X genre, that players in the 4X genre have never had before. And Old World, because of this, is such an impressive experience. The singular focus of its design is all geared toward this character system fueling the gameplay experience. And it's such a beautifully designed system. And he and his team at Mohawk Games, a small, dedicated group of people, deserve all the accolades they are going to get this year. And by God, I hope they get them, because they made a wonderful, brilliant, meaningful 4X strategy game. So that is number 2. That brings us to number 1. And number 1 is a game that I got on a whim, that was recommended to me by Steam, that almost no one outside of a very small group of strategy gamers knows about. And that is a game called Slipways. That's Slipways, Slipways. And Slipways, at its core, is a puzzle game. It is a game about moving resources from one planet in space to another planet in space. And each of those planets have needs, otherwise known as inputs, and each of those planets have goods that they export. They don't export those goods unless the needs are met, and if the needs are met, then they can export more of those goods. But it's called Slipways because there's a physical visual representation of planets exchanging goods with one another. The way you progress in this game is you're building out a kind of space network, trade network, connecting one planet to another to take the resources that one planet produces and connect it to the resources that another planet needs. And then what's called a slipway is created between those two planets where those goods are being exchanged. And at first, it appears to be... It's one of those games that is easy to grasp what you're supposed to do, but it's extremely... There's so much depth and so many layers to it that you're in this constant state of sort of cyclical discovery of, oh my god, that works that way? Oh my god, I can do that? Oh my god, I can mine asteroids? I can set up a research station next to this specific resource, and oh my gosh, it produces that, and I can send that thing that it produces over here. You get to a point where those types of discoveries are just snowballing into these aha moments that create genuinely, like dopamine rushes in you. You're like, yeah, I'm smart. Yeah, I get how this works. I will say, to really plumb to the depth that the game can offer, it is quite a hard game. It really is. And on top of this puzzle element layer is a sort of corporation system, or excuse me, not a corporation system, but a race system, I guess, where you're selecting from one of 5 different races and then selecting within those 5 different races one of several different sort of abilities or technologies that become available to you to research that are specific to that alien species, that allow you to be able to break the game or engage in the game, like that fundamentally change the way one of the game's systems or mechanics sort of work. The maps are procedurally generated. They have map seeds. And none of no two are the same. There's a campaign system. There's an endless mode. It became, for me, just the simplicity of its design belies an extremely complex, well thought out game that is designed by literally one person. And the fact that this person was able to represent a design idea with such clear vision and such precise implementation is very impressive in and of itself. But the fact that it is not openly hostile to the player, that it invites experimentation to learn its systems and its mechanics, the fact that it is easy to pick up but hard to master makes playing Slipways the most enjoyable experience that I have had all year. And I'm a person who I typically do not enjoy puzzle games for the same reasons that I don't enjoy platformers, which is that at some point I just feel like my ability, my skills within the game, like my ability to apply myself and my approach just fundamentally don't work for the game at some point, and I can't progress, and I walk away and I become frustrated and I feel dumb and I don't want to play it anymore. Which says something, because I'm a huge strategy game player, and there's a lot of elements of strategy gaming where you are pushing through not knowing and question marks and the differences in the way that information is presented to you. And puzzle games oftentimes obfuscate information in order to inflate the sense of difficulty or gate the sense of progression. And what I've learned in the last couple of years is that puzzle game designers have gotten a lot. Grindstone is another example of this. Puzzle game designers have gotten a lot better at making that progression and making those more difficult mechanics be more emergent, and in some cases where they need to be, more expressly communicated to the player. So that they understand, oh, okay, so here's the mechanic, and then the game presents you with a number of scenarios in which to use what you've just learned, essentially. And Slipways is very much like that. It gives you all of the information, it teaches you everything you need to know, and from there on out, you're on this extremely satisfying, beautiful journey of discovery in space with planets and chill music, and it's just an absolute delight. And I'm totally comfortable and thrilled with it being my number one. Even over Old World, which, again, those two switched spots so many times, but I think Old World will the fruits of its labor will come back, and games like it will be on this list in the future. Slipways is a unique experience, and it's not very often that I get to recognize games like this on my list, and the designer of this game deserves to be recognized, and Slipways really does deserve to be played by more people. It is a great game, and it is my 2021 Game of the Year. So, that's a wrap, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Of course, anyone who knows me knows that I really like to talk about things that I'm passionate about, and I'm very passionate about video games. So this is running in toward the hour and a half mark, and I do not apologize for it. I do not apologize for it at all. I hope that you have found this an interesting list. I hope that you have found some games that maybe you want to go check out and maybe even play. Thank you all for listening. Be safe, be well, be healthy, happy holidays, and may the beginning of 2022 bring us all joy and health. Again, thank you for listening. I hope 2021 was as good of a year as it possibly could have been for you, and here's to hoping that 2022 starts looking up for all of us. Thank you, and goodbye.